So a framework, as I was thinking about this session, was how do I think about how the city government is different than national, state, or even what I'll call a hyper-local level, like we see here in Minneapolis with neighborhood funding, or we used to have with neighborhood funding. And I know there's a whole bunch of different columns that could be added here that would maybe look at things differently. But as I started to think about the role that they intersect with our organization, is there direct funding opportunity? Does that level of government have influence on policy and regulations? Is there a bureaucratic contact that I would have a relationship with or a potential for relationship with? And then is there the opportunity to have a political contact? And all these things, I think, as you see, it's either likely or somewhat likely or not likely. There's a lot of gray area there. But what it did for me was help solidify where and why I think for many of our organizations, depending on your geography, I guess another caveat, is at that city intersection. And yeah, I would even argue that what I heard from Brenda's colleague's introduction is that there's 44 cities in greater, 45 if you include Minneapolis and Hennepin County. While they have a stronger relationship, in my opinion, with the county than our organization does, so much of the work that gets done is at the city level. And so really trying to frame this conversation, and I'm sure the conversation will stray to different levels of government, but to really try and focus it at that city level and partnership level. Sound good? All right, that's the framework here. So let's just start at the very beginning. And I think we've all, or at least many of us, have seen different ways that cities have played an instrumental role in land trust getting going. Many times introducing the land trust model itself. I think of some pretty powerful examples, and Brenda, I'm sure we'll talk about this. Predecessor to the Carver County Community Land Trust was the city of Chaska. And it was really under that city's leadership that land trust started. The city of Houston, city of Chicago, both very successful community land trusts, were initiated, and in both those cases are still run or quasi-run by the city. So a city kind of taking the leadership versus maybe a neighborhood or a community group starting a community land trust. Participating in the planning, to a lesser degree. When our organization started, arguably our organization was started from a bunch of concerned community folks, but they started engaging the city early on. And as we got started, and as we started to develop our bylaws, as we started our ground lease and what we would do and how we would do it, city staff as well as city leadership, electeds, were part of that process in the planning process. Staffing. There still are many land trusts where the staffing is either fully paid for or partially paid for by the city as organizations get up and started. Initial funding commitments. A lot of community land trusts, whether they were started by the city or if they were started by the community, often are able to get some seed money from the get-go. In our case, there was this I don't know which administration it was, but things called empowerment zones. Here in Minneapolis, the empowerment zone, the city of Minneapolis didn't really have the flexibility to throw it into their budget, but the empowerment zone had some flexible dollars. And our startup was started because the empowerment zone invested $25,000 or $50,000 into our early days of staffing. I think there's examples, especially in the early days, for a lot of community land trusts where a city or cities are investing some operational or programmatic dollars to help that organization get going. Providing project funding and financing, I think my take on most land trusts are at some level, if they're successful, the city is participating in one or more or multiple ways, whether it be financing, direct funding, or even long-term forgivable loans that we'll talk about. And then ideal scenarios. I don't know if there is. The ideal scenario is the one that works. But I think my and looking at where I've had some envy from an organizational perspective, in part because we were started as a community organization, I think some of the land trusts today that have the greatest potential for success are the ones that are started as an enterprise of a city, but are started in such a way where there is a takeout. That the early founders of the initiative said, once we get to 20 units, once we get to $1 million in the balance sheet, whatever it may be, that they set some thresholds at that point in time. The the CLT function spins off and becomes its own entity. I see the benefits of cities or government running land trusts, but I also have a lot of fears that politics change, governments change, and at some point in time, it's probably best to take all that early horsepower that can be provided by a city and spin it off to its own enterprise so that it has a better chance of surviving some of these other things that happen to it. Questions? Thoughts? Anything true in your mind? All right.
You want comments at this point?
Yeah. I want this to be more discussion. We'll get through the slides. Yeah.
Right, well,
observations.
So I would just say my experience has been a little different in that I feel like, yeah, a lot of our work has been in the city of Denver, but where we've had the most challenges are the things that the city asks us to take on. And so, there's a certain commitment from them, et cetera, as kind of what they're going to do from a funding standpoint. But it ends up being really problematic. So, personally, I would say I would have the city, local government, arm's length relationship. I think being able to get resources, to your point about the startup side, is certainly critical. But I do worry, and I've seen it, where the city, because they have been that startup or that seed capital for that work, that CLT, then has these expectations that you're going to do the things that the city policy or which may not make sense from a business standpoint for running your CLT. So I think there's for me a big caution around how that relationship with the city does operate. I hear what you're saying about that initial capacity. I worry about how long a city feels it needs to stay in that role. Even from board members, like if you're going to continue to have a presence on the board, does that mean now the agenda is going to be driven by those city officials? So.
Observations. Other thoughts?
As we get farther into it, there is a slide that'll come up and it'll talk about the pros and the cons.
Okay.
Because there are pros and cons to all of those. Jeff talked about Chaska. Chaska, that CLT was definitely started by the city of Chaska and its staff people. Once the housing market in 2008, 2009 crashed, the city did not have the money to fund the program. They didn't have the staff and it was very small. There were only 18 homes in the program, but it was unable to even be the steward to that land. So what they did, their educational partner at that time was a community development organization within the county called Carver County Community Development Agency. Affordable housing was kind of their wheelhouse. So they had asked them to take over the program, and for years it just did that. It stewarded the program, but then it eventually had it grow. My organization was started by both citizens and city staff and elected officials. It was a unique opportunity within the city of Minnetonka. They did have the foresight to say this cannot be within the city because we see that this need is in more communities than just ours. It's in our neighbors as well. And so it's a better approach to have it as an arm's length different entity. But we'll get farther in and get more into those pros and cons.
Any other thoughts, observations on this one? So maybe pick on some folks here. Why are your cities interested in one or more levels of supporting your organization?
For our small city, we're counting 90,000 people. The city of Salida is 5,000 officially. They actually wanted the arm's length opportunity, one, because of political fluctuations in the future, but also just that the common sentiment, they don't want government getting involved in housing, and so that gives them the appropriate distance to support us somewhat and have us do the work for them.
We find that they're interested in preserving affordability, but also neighborhood revitalization, because we come into some of the older neighborhoods in some of our cities and we buy the homes and do the modernization and the updates, and that's good for the overall neighborhood, so they like to support the CLT. for a variety of reasons, but that's a piece of it.
Yeah, I would say our relationship with the city and their, what I'll say, reluctant early endorsement of the City of Lakes Community Land Trust was around preserving affordability. I think as costs have gone up and the subsidies have gotten deeper, there's, I think, an increased maybe shift as well over to the preserving that public investment and looking at mechanisms to make sure that it goes further from their political, what staff can sell to council members in the case of our city. I think the more emerging priority for the city of Minneapolis is recognizing that only organizations like ours and Twin Cities Habitat are really focused at going to, that 50%, 60% AMI, and what that means as it relates to the populations that we're serving in home ownership at that level, and seeing the intentionality around that level has surfaced as a more emerging priority. But that wasn't, in my opinion, a priority 20 years ago. It was really about long-term affordability. And so recognizing kind of where the importance of our organization is played. I also argue that we're a pretty good bureaucratic partner. We've nailed, I think, pretty well how to report for the city, how to make sure our documents are in good order, and that we're easy to work with, or easier to work with than maybe we were 10 or 15 years ago. And I think from a staff perspective, that goes a long way when you're working with your colleagues at the city. Other thoughts? Yeah.
I think when we start looking down at the owner occupancy requirements and maintaining your housing standards, I know that for our partner cities, one of the things that they truly appreciate is that they know when we come in, we are not doing just cosmetic work to these homes. In fact, the cosmetic work is sometimes what we will leave to the side for the homeowner to come in and do the painting, because we're looking at safety, health, and energy efficiency to make our community better through the housing. And I think that has been one of the things that the communities have come back to say, it's a good investment to go into the land trust. They're a trusted partner, and we know that their work is good. Where there are times when a for-profit builder can come in on an RFP and they're not quite sure what they're going to get at the end of the day. So I think that's been helpful for us as well.
I would just say, so our primary service area is Duluth, and it's essentially a Rust Belt city. And so the big role that we played sort of in the initial, when we were in our first growth mode, was somebody's building something here. Hallelujah. And then also fixing things up, and then I think doing it in a way that's uncompliant, just was what enamored the city then. And it's just interesting to reflect on this now, because I'm 29 years married and 24 years on the job, and I'm thinking, not all that different than a marriage. Sometimes you need to take a little vacation together, reevaluate why we're still in this. But it has changed and evolved as the market's evolved and as we've grown. But I will say this, I've been pretty frustrated lately because the push is more on rental in our city, and I'm trying to sort of bring the ownership thing back. It's frustrating, to just have them not focusing on the ownership piece, and frankly just screwing up a lot of things. So yeah, good reflection.
I wonder why the push toward rental versus ownership.
Scale.
I had a question for you, for those of you in the room. I'm curious, I know some of our elected leaders have been, their attention has been redrawn towards institutional purchasing of single-family homes and the implications of that. Is that coming up as an issue, or coming up in the conversations that you're having as another benefit of the CLT model, is being able to keep capital?
Yes, it is. Our treasurer is also the mayor of Minnetonka, and so he is working with a group of mayors throughout, heavily metro focused, but there are some from outstate, And that is one of the issues that they are really working on, is how do we stop investors from coming in and scooping up these properties? And it goes back to that part, when they do that, they often don't do the work that you and I would do to those homes. We provide a good home for a family. The others put Band-Aids on things, and that just makes home ownership more difficult. You can call it affordable in the beginning, but if it's not affordable to maintain moving forward, what good have we done? So right now, yes, there are a group of elected officials here in Minnesota that is concerned about that.
I'd agree. I started when you asked that question, I was a bit more cynical, but I see ways that it's not just politicians, it is city staff who see the importance of keeping some of these assets out of investors' hands and looking for ways to create opportunities for folks that live in the city, especially in our case, North Minneapolis. So varied ways cities support community land trusts, and with the exception of staffing for our organization, which we touched a little bit on in the Chasta example, I think I'll just talk about this firsthand from the City of Lakes Community Land Trust perspective. Funding, whether it be forgivable loans, if the city in our case puts affordability gap into a land trust property, those funds are structured as a 30-year forgivable loan against the land trust. Loans in the form of construction financing that we pay back upon completion of homes. Grants, I think increasingly the city of Minneapolis is putting some pretty serious money on the table that we are able to either apply for, or our programs are some of the lead out programs that benefit from these grant funds. Affordability covenants, some cities, in the case of Minneapolis, going into a bit of a tangent here, has started its own shared equity program, and they're using affordability covenants to ensure the long-term affordability of their shared equity ownership program that the city is starting. Leverage, I think at least all of us in Minnesota, and I'm guessing other states, this is applicable, where if you get a commitment from one level of government, you use that to leverage against other levels of government so that you can hopefully come up with the full package that you need to actually make a home affordable. Long-term affordability policies. In our case, the city of Minneapolis has really, I think, made some huge advancements over the last 2 or 3 years. Arguably, there's been more done in the last 2 to 3 years for long-term affordability in this city than there had been the last 20 years. And that really is, in most cases, if the city is selling a lot or they're investing deeper levels of affordability gap, they want to ensure that those properties are affordable long-term beyond 30 years, which has really created, I think, a huge opportunity for our organization as well as Habitat for Humanity. Inclusionary housing policies. This hasn't played out. It definitely is starting to play out on the rental side here. And our city council wasn't ready to go there. And arguably, I don't know if the city staff was, but the city of Minneapolis, and I look to my Minneapolis friends here, maybe know this better, but I think once we get to the point that from the point in time that this policy was passed a couple years ago to the 1,000th condo unit, moving forward, there will be inclusionary housing policies for multifamily ownership projects. But we got to get to 1,000 new condo units before that will kick in. And I don't know where we are in that timeline. Am I on? Is that how you understand that?
Condo building since then, right? So we're at 50 units.
Yeah.
And so with the IHO inclusionary housing policy, that's the city implementing and managing, or is it that you guys have that City Lakes or?
I think it's on the city, and I think they're probably using the planning department or permits for construction to monitor that.
I will just say, City of Denver, here's our experience with inclusionary zoning. Does not work, totally ineffective, because the city wanted to run it themselves. And so because they chose to take that on, of the, let's just say 14 to 1,500 homes that were created through inclusionary zoning, most of this through large master redevelopments like our airport, our old airport, which called Stapleton, got redeveloped. So they had IHO inclusionary housing ordinance there. They lost 300 plus homes out of that so 1,400 home bucket, either through foreclosure or through just, resale formula because no one was watching the store. Again, because it was just through a deed restriction. But that's been kind of like going back to saying that works. At least in Denver, it's a bad public policy. So.
I think in the case, at least in Minneapolis, for me, the challenge is when do we finally get to 1,000 units that then we start enacting the policy.
I see.
I think once it is enacted, for example, right now the city is contracting with us to essentially monitor their shared equity program moving forward. So this is years out from now, but at least I think an outside entity is going to be the one that's going to be enforcing the affordability restrictions. Yeah.
Do other people have experience with inclusionary housing?
Thanks.
Maybe a more positive one. I'm sorry, I'm fairly negative on the Denver one.
The city of Edina does have that policy, but they allow the contractors to buy their way out. So you don't have to put the units in, you can pay the city off. For my organization, the benefit to that has been, now they have this money, what can they do with it? And that has been a way for us they've given us a line of credit at 0% interest to fund our program and purchase and rehab the homes. And then they are also allowing part of that money to be given to us as a grant. So if anyone comes on the bus tour, you'll see some of the homes that we've been able to do there. And again, this is a first ring suburb where land values are extremely high. So if not for that program, I wouldn't be doing the volume there.
Brenda, do you know if anyone has actually produced affordable units? Last I heard, everyone was just...
Everyone's paying it off.
Again, a small town, but that's been a major driving force for us getting opportunities to build and continue to be in that jurisdiction. The other jurisdictions are also now playing along because developers are realizing that's part of the trend. It's definitely working as part of the market. So we're in a rural resort community. We're selling homes at a third of what the market is. It really is one of the tools that seems to be working in that environment. And I think you do need that big differential to the policy.
So there you have developers who are being told they have to do a certain percentage. Instead of them going and coming to you and saying, hey, can you take this on?
You take this on, here's the land, right? We don't want anything to do with it, or hey, we'll build these units on the side, tell us what they look like, and then the price point.
But they have to produce a unit, not pay off like a guy.
Yeah, and that option of paying off was being pursued, and they changed the policy now. On auction, only for fractional.
I'll just say another example that is new, and we just proposed for another city in sort of the rural mountain area in Colorado, is basically a secondary zoning code with reduced dimensional standards, increased uses by right, and expedited review process for any project that meets specified affordability thresholds that came from a housing needs assessment. So it's a voluntary program. It will not work on its own. It will still need to be coupled with subsidies. So I think the idea is to draw affordable housing developers or CLTs into the area, and educate market rate developers on how to use affordable housing finance mechanisms so that they qualify for the more favorable zoning. Yeah, we'll talk offline.
Your own community.
Well, I think recently the city of Minneapolis got quite a bit of notoriety for their ability to eliminate single family housing zoning. And I think a number of us were trying to say, so what does that really mean, especially in the ownership space? I think when you start to look at larger units, there could be, and I think there is the opportunity on the rental side to be able to enforce inclusionary zoning opportunities. But on the ownership side, I know a number of us have been in conversations that folks really trying to dig into this to see if anything's really changed. And it hasn't. I think it just is too costly without some sort of what I would say a carrot and or a stick to incent it. We're not going to see it on the ownership side until this theoretical 1,000th unit hits here in Minneapolis, and then we're able to do something. And at that point, by that time, our little town will start thinking like a city, and we'll be too little, too late. Other thoughts on inclusionary? Tax forfeiture here in Minnesota. I'll speak specifically to Hennepin County and the city of Minneapolis. The county is the forfeiture entity on behalf of the state. And our city has worked pretty well that if our organization, or really pretty much, I think I've not heard any nonprofit, if there's a property out there that is on the tax forfeiture list, Hennepin County reaching out to our city to say, hey, we want you to take advantage of your first right with the county to be able to buy that back. And I know our organization has been able to get our hands on a number of properties, and I'm pretty sure Habitat's use that tool. Not so much these days, but we may be back in a point in time where those tax forfeitures are a great mechanism through the city to be able to pull opportunities into the land trust. Receivership transfers. There's been some pretty bad landlords and or home entities that have owned single-family rentals in the city of Minneapolis, and over the years, the city has been able to exercise its legal rights to take on receivership of those properties. And as the city has been able to kind of work through that system, the back end of that are some opportunities for affordable housing providers to step in, take these assets, and put them back into productive, affordable ownership use. And so there have been a couple instances over the last 15 years in Minneapolis where the city has taken that aggressive stance with investment companies and or landlords to bring those properties into their fold. And ultimately the hope is on the back end that all those units would become affordable ownership opportunities. And then reduce taxes. Talking a little bit about this tomorrow in a session I'll be talking through, but to the credit of our city and to the surprise of me a couple years ago, when the city was exploring their own shared equity program, they realized that property taxes could be an impediment to affordability. And the city staff reached out to the city assessor's office in Minnesota. Not every city has its own assessing department, but certain cities do. Most of it's done at the county level. But the city development staff reached out to the city assessment staff and said, hey, is there any other way that we can look at this? And to the credit of our assessor's office, they went to the State Department of Revenue and got a ruling that basically said they could assess shared equity or long-term affordable properties using a different methodology. So this spring was the first spring, thinking through the whole assessment process, where households who purchased through the City of Lakes Community Land Trust were assessed at the affordable land trust price versus the fair market value. And for us, it didn't equate to necessarily benefit to the CLT, other than the homeowners that we've been able to serve saw, in some cases, significant reductions in their property taxes. And I think moving forward, that's going to create, I think, opportunities for additional affordability. I know the city of Edina is looking at this, and other cities are looking at what city of Minneapolis did to see how and if they can replicate that.
Jeff, do you have any idea in dollars and cents, like what an average savings has been for folks?
Yeah.
I'm just asking because we have new buyers out there looking, and in St. Paul the taxes are $4,000 on a $225,000 property, and it just kills how much folks can afford.
Yeah. So as of now, remembering that the assessment process it lags about a year behind. But at year end, there were 340 homeowners who lived in land trust CLT properties. Their gross savings from previous taxes to current year taxes was over $270,000 across those 340 homeowners, recognizing that a portion, 10, 15, maybe 20% of the homeowners hadn't yet benefited from that assessment change yet. So close to, I think if I have this data, I think it was like $900 per household on average, which is not an insignificant amount of money. And some homeowners saw a couple $1,000s worth of savings, depending on how the kind of when we came in and where the values were at the point in time that the city enacted this policy.
Is that policy linked to the land trust mechanism? The land itself is trust?
It's not. So kind of behind the scenes, what we do every year in December is I send a file of all land trust properties, all resales to the city assessor's office, and then they do their financial mumbo jumbo and do their projections, and that's how they get to it. But they're planning on using it for their perpetual affordable housing program, which is a restricted covenant program that's using a 2% fixed rate formula. So I think they're going to be kind of working it both ways for the same purpose.
And then similarly, I know this isn't the case for you all, but for other land trusts, are there CLTs that take on that tax burden of the land organization, or is that mostly transferred to the homeowner? A policy like this directly benefits.
I'm not aware of, I look to my other colleagues here, I'm not aware of any land trust that pays the property taxes.
We don't, but we talked to our assessor and he revalued our houses
Okay.
to take into account the land. We're part of the city, so we didn't pay taxes.
And that's Wisconsin.
No, this is Missouri.
Missouri, sorry. Okay,
Yeah,
okay.
so our county assessor assessed the houses based on without the land. So we're a relatively small area, so if you do that.
Yeah, we do a lot of land banking, so we're paying property taxes on that. So regardless of our status or regardless of what's going to be built, when it's vacant land, there's really no way of getting around it in Colorado. So you can make all kinds of appeals, but try to work with either the local assessor or the state assessor. But right now, unless we change legislation, if we were a faith-based community or we were a housing authority, yes, we could do property taxes.
So the commitment to affordability isn't enough.
No, it's not. It is not.
Some problem in Colorado, and there's talk about trying to do something for CLT statewide, but currently if you partner with a housing authority and you give them 0.01% ownership interest,
That's right.
create a special purpose entity that holds title to the land, then taxes are abated for that land. We have condos and townhomes, and the condos, we're paying 8 units on a plot of land, third of an acre, we're paying $20 a year. But the individual townhomes that we have in the separate development that are scattered, we're paying $400 a year on those. And so that's property tax we're trying to abate.
Is this one you?
I can do it.
It is.
So city funding tools for CLTs are obviously the loans. The loans can be direct to the buyers. They can be forgiven or recaptured over time, depending on how long that homeowner stays in that home. They can also be something that can be assumed by the next buyer, so it's more attached to that property, but in direct benefit for that buyer, or it can go directly to the CLT. For our organization, we have seen most of our city funding going directly to our CLT. There just seems to be that idea that we will continue to preserve that affordable home ownership. But on the side of buyers, what we've seen is our communities trying to get other entities within the community to start a foundation or through their HRA to do down payment assistance and loan programs to partner. So those things by way of the city through a different entity. There also can be grants that can be directly to the buyers or grants to the CLT for affordability. We get grants from many of our cities. Some come in the form of a CDBG grant and through our application to that. Others will just have additional funds from their tax levy that they will put towards our organization. Grants to buyers have come mostly through the partnerships with the HRAs within the communities. And we are seeing, in the communities that I serve, we are seeing a lot of our entities start to do first generation homebuyer programs. And it has been quite rewarding to see those first generation people buy homes in our program with the benefit of those nonprofits and cities that we're partnering with. And then they can also give us just direct program operating support through home CDBG. If you're a CHOTO, we are. So we get money from Hennepin County through that. A lot of our cities do provide the CDBG funding. Most of that goes back into our properties. But then we also have contracted services. Our founding city was the city of Minnetonka. They give us money every year to administer and take care of the homes within that community. We have over 60 homes in their community, so it's a lot of work just to be the steward for that, and the city appreciates that, so they give us that direct funding through a contract service. So, questions, thoughts?
The Rondo folks be willing to talk about what's kind of being proposed? The inheritance fund?
Yeah. She's got more details on this than I do. She's been in conversations directly, but it dovetails really well with our right to return to Rondo. Basically, say the mayor is trying to get the council to pass a portion of his budget that will provide funding for families that people that were either directly displaced when I-94 was built in Rondo or their descendants. I can't remember, I think it might be $1 million right now. I don't remember exactly what the dollar figure is that he's proposing, but that will go directly towards the cost of purchase.
Now, as I understand, it will be direct buyer assistance through a forgivable loan for buyers, and then they're also making some dollars available for forgivable rehab, I think, funds. Yeah.
Be eligible in all of Ramsey County, or
That'll
is
just
it
be
designed to be within?
It'll be just, I think most of it will be for Rondo. I think there is a little bit of money that will be able to be in the rest of the city.
Same color.
Yeah, not up.
Question on the grants. What are you guys doing about ARPA funds?
We're seeing some direct investments in programs. Through our buyer initiated program is currently benefiting from some ARPA funds. The city has also structured another fund to be used to assist existing low-income homeowners that might be facing loss of housing, using the land trust as an intervention. So coming in and solving for debt and or rehab with those ARPA funds. And then a pretty sizable direct investment of close to $3 million in a condo ACK rehab of a former building into some condo units. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just curious, everyone familiar with ARPA funds?
Mhm.
Work with them?
Yeah.
Here, so in Colorado, we got legislation to allocate about $400 million of those ARPA dollars for affordable housing through four different pieces of legislation. Right? Okay. So, and it's maybe actually a bit more than $400 million because of the services for permanent support housing and mental health. Anyway, that's all. I mean, that's like, we've never had that kind of money. I know Minnesota, in particular, you guys have always had lots of money committed to affordable housing, which we're always envious of. No, seriously, that mechanism for it. So we have this kind of first, I mean, really this $100 million is a lot. The concern is obviously how much of that actually gets to the homeownership side. I think there is, a very large, sophisticated multifamily rental development world. I'm sure that's here too. How do we make sure those dollars are going to CLTs both across the state? So, anyway.
And doing it within the timeline, right?
And doing it by 2026, right?
As Jeff said, I think here in Minnesota and in the metro area, the push really has been towards rental.
Okay.
We did get a pretty nice award from Hennepin County to expand to other communities. So right now we serve 14 of those 44. We're hoping to get into at least 2 or 3 more.
And the ARPA money's going
we got some ARPA money for that. But the majority of it is been put into affordable rental and ending homelessness.
And I know this is jumping away from the city, but look to my colleagues, I don't think any of the state ARPA money, with the exception of maybe the home help dollars, is going toward home ownership. It's not going toward projects or new creation of units, other than just preservation of existing and helping folks out.
I think there's some that the Met Council
Okay.
It's a regional governing body.
Thank you, boss. Just help us. We're from Colorado.
Mostly water and sewer.
So this is like your, okay, your MPA or whatever, MPO, Metropolitan Planning Organization.
Yeah, yep.
That's the mecca.
And they do have smaller buckets of funding that they typically, or at least in the past, had aligned with the state's RFP process. And this year they are putting some dollars out, I think, specific for affordable home ownership, really trying, as I understand it, trying to get some of the suburban communities that maybe haven't necessarily invested in affordable home ownership to put some money and resources there.
Good luck with that, sorry.
Hey, I got two of them.
Community every day, first in the suburbs of Ramsey County, and then they want to buy a park and put a splash pad in. It's like, oh, for
Right, but there's 180 municipalities, right, give or take, in the Twin Cities Metro. So even if a handful lean toward it, there might be some money for them, right? I don't know. Yeah.
I'm curious if anybody's doing on the contracted services front. If anyone's sort of teamed up with their city to work on land acquisition, title cleanup, due diligence things. Our city, in their infinite wisdom, started a vacant lot program, and we've been the recipient of about 10 of them so far, and we've built on 1.5 of them because they all suck. But it just, like one way we could get out front of that is if they would contract with us to sort of like do some of that cleanup work, where somebody, but there's just not enough planning and thinking in it, and it's biting us in the backside. So, anybody doing that? Anywhere?
We had post-flood infill lots, and our flood is 25 years ago now, but it seems to take 10, 15 years to get that stuff figured out. So in that case, it was really common that they tore down the home and just left the pieces underground. So that was about 10 years. But they would give CDBG funding. So we received CDBG funding we could use for the infrastructure cleanup and then the redoing of all the infrastructure that was left. So we were fortunate to have that, but then it made them hesitant to provide home funding because they looked at it as, well, we already gave you $50,000 in CDBG for that lot. But that was because we were cleaning up what was.
I think you weren't going there with these comments, Aaron, but I do think, and Jeff Corey, you mentioned this a little earlier, I think, in your intro comments about being poised to have ready projects or programs for ARPA funds, because stuff is going to fall apart. And my gut tells me that housing and the economy is really going to take a turn for the worse. And so to the degree that we can be constantly being creative and pivoting and show that we have a ready off-the-shelf approach. I got to think my colleagues over at Habitat have already kind of built out a business plan around this, but it's like to be at the ready to be the city's best friend on helping them meet their obligation is going to be a real important opportunity.
So there's the ARPA dollars, but then there's also $1 trillion infrastructure bill that passed. And so I know local governments are getting a chunk of that. And so we're trying to line up with them as to how we can use some of those dollars, not just for traditional infrastructure like water, sewer, but also streets, gutters, those kinds of things, but also talk about how we can get to more of a net zero with what we're doing. Like, be it residential or commercial in our case, that's kind of a big part for us is we want to take our schools or the other things that are in land trust with us, we want to take it off the grid, right? We really want that. So there may be some of those infrastructure dollars also to think about, which has nothing to do with ARPA, but it's coming to local governments, right, and counties. So
I think one of the things that we've talked about right here is we have to always be willing to step in and be that good partner and that innovative, creative, and fast on our feet and ready to go. I have 2 cities that I work with, and they have home ownership rehab loan programs. I got 2 phone calls in a panic from 2 different city administrators saying, we didn't realize this, but our funds have been paid back. So many people have sold their homes. We collected this money back and we had put more money into the program, we can't sit on this, and if we don't spend it by May 30th, it's gone. Can you do more homes? Yeah, give me the money. But, you know, you have to be willing to be creative and get out there. You know, when you have a smaller staff like our organization does, it's amazing. With the cities, 1 or 2 folks there can know you, but there's a whole lot of others that are there working that don't know who you are. And it's difficult to try to weigh with your time, how much time can you give to a city to get them all engaged in understanding and knowing about you.
I do think having the messaging prepared for what we maybe see as the inevitable is important. Our organization is currently still part of a housing authority as well, and the investment in chronic homelessness over the last 5 years is it's so significant that it's really changing the industry. And I think for those of us who have worked with those trying to reach self-sufficiency, it's pretty clear that those programs are being left behind. And so you mentioned programs for first-generation homeowners. In North Dakota and in Northwest Minnesota, we're reaching the first generation of individuals who can't afford homes. And that's a messaging thing, right? That any legislator should hear that and realize this is not good for us. And we need to, not that we're hoping for things to fail, but we're seeing this happen, and we need to be ready to present that message and embrace the opportunities that will come to us when that seems like it's going to happen fairly soon.
So we talked quite a bit in depth around these city policy tools, and I thought maybe on this slide, just turn it back to all of you. What else has your city done that we haven't spoken about already that has somehow or in some way furthered your community land trust activities? Anything we haven't discussed? Don't. Yeah, say more. Yeah.
So in Denver specifically, we've had some changes in the zoning that affect both homeownership and rental housing, where now any developer that's coming in to get permits, they're not calling it inclusionary housing, they're calling it, what is it?
There's expanding housing affordability.
Yes, expand, because it's a zoning change, which basically says you're going to come in for permits to build a condo development. You're going to have a certain percentage of affordable. And we'll actually, if you do more, we'll put some money into it to actually increase it. Accurate? Disconnect here is, again, how to make sure these developers don't know how to do affordable home ownership. So they're doing a market rate deal. So how do we make sure that they're getting linked up with the habitat or the elevation or whatever the CLTs that are in our community? But zoning has been, I think, a real key piece in at least not just in Denver, but in certain other areas of the state. We're getting to density is also really, that's been a foreign word in the past, and so I think there's greater acceptance in certain communities for density. And so we even had a state, it was a legislation that passed a year ago, right? Which basically requires local municipalities to have certain basic zoning standards if you're going to want to have access to dollars. Am I saying that right, Mary?
Yeah, so at the state level, this was a development incentive grant that started out with a planning grant. So it offered our smaller municipalities funding to change their zoning code, which would make them eligible for the development incentives grant, which is a larger pot of money. So a lot of carrots from the state level. The expanding housing affordability in the city of Denver is a combination of a mandatory affordable housing program paired with, if you go above and beyond the requirements, a lot of incentives, including access to the city's affordable housing review team, which gets you through city planning much quicker. Supposedly. The market rate's really slow right now.
I know, everything's really slow.
So many vacancies, but yeah, so those are some of the things. One of the things that's getting a little sticky with city support actually is the City Council just passed a prioritization policy, which is known as a preference policy in other places. And they have asked affordable housing providers, including community land trusts, to fill 30% of the units with people at risk of or who have been displaced from the community, which could potentially result in having to leave units vacant for a longer period of time, effectively reducing the amount of city subsidy that is going into these projects.
So I think this was one I was going to talk to. All right. So relationships with both the electeds and the bureaucrats is critical. I think I've learned, I've been doing this for 20 years, but over the last 5 months, I've learned a whole heck of a lot more. For folks who don't know, my spouse used to work for the this thing called the Met Council, but about 5 months ago, she started as the housing director for the city of St. Paul, and just opening my mind to, I think greater appreciation for what's going on in the city of Minneapolis with the colleagues who I work with on a bureaucratic level. But I think growing a lot more empathy, because I need to, as a spouse to a bureaucrat on the other side of the river, has really made me much more aware of how important those relationships are for CLTs and developers alike. So recognizing that the relationships with both are very important and for different reasons. The bureaucrats, I've met a few of my spouse's employees, her staff, and they rattle off. The first time I met them, they're like, yep, I've been through 4 housing directors and 6 PD over in St. Paul directors. And that's, they're there for the long term. They're riding it out. They're committed. They want to do more. They feel like they're always getting pushed and pulled in different directions. But to have some empathy with that and to be the resource, as we've been talking about, to make their lives easy. How do we take more files off of their desk to make their lives easier, and recognizing that they're there for the long term? You rub them wrong, and it's going to take a long, long time to recover. And then on the elected side, having your champions and trying to figure out how you can kind of help push something forward that's going to be specific to you, realizing that it may only last 2 or 4 years, depending on the election cycle in the community. And then with both, don't burn bridges. I'll just I'm blown away here in the Twin Cities, where, and this is I think important with so many community land trusts, is that your city staff person, you maybe have a beef with them, and maybe it doesn't matter to you anymore, but then they go and get a job in Minnetonka, and all of a sudden I've already soiled the water for Brenda, because she has to deal with the person that I've rubbed wrong, and that person now hates land trust. And so I think it does all of us good to make sure that we're trying to keep positive relationships so that we're not creating potential impediments for one another moving forward. I don't know if there's other thoughts or stories around that, but I think...
I'm curious what you guys do to kind of build a relationship.
Did you say less?
Say yes.
Oh, say less.
When they want a report from you, do it and get it to them by the deadline of when they want it. There's a reason why they want it by a date. Just do it, whether you want to or not. And part of this, Jeff, also is with elected officials, so it's a city council person. If the city council person doesn't like the staff person, that's a really, it's a really touchy situation in a lot of cases.
Great points of perspective.
But do you guys take public officials with the city or with all the cities, say, of Hennepin County, or are there things you do kind of to get them out to see what you're doing?
Yeah, at least once a year, I try to have a sit down with every one of the 13 Minneapolis City Council members and the mayor and or his office or their office. And with that, I think increasingly, I'm trying to bring at least somebody that we've served in home ownership in their ward along with me to that meeting, and let them tell that story, and then bring the numbers. So when sitting down with a council member in South Minneapolis, I can say, oh, by the way, I don't know if you knew there's 65 homeowners that bought through the land trust that are constituents of yours, and being at a place where you can start to throw out some hefty numbers depending on the ward in our case. And city staff, I think Michelle's points are dead on. Just help them be successful and not bog them down and cause issues for them.
Answer the phone right away and say yes, even if it's a yes, but I got to figure it out. That's really what it comes down to. But it's engaging them. They may think that this is a solution and the way it should go, but having that conversation with our organization has taken us in a different direction. There's a different way we can approach this and work together. And maybe sometimes it might not be me that they need to work with. It might be, you know what, I can't do this, but let's reach out to Habitat to see if they have the capacity to do it, and maybe we still can keep it as a land trust project. So it's really about answering the phone, answering the emails, getting their information in a timely manner, and staying engaged. I meet with all of the communities that we serve. I do go to one either working session for their city council or to a city council meeting and give them the updates of what we've done that year.
Just 2 quick points to that saying yes. So when I was new, maybe I shouldn't have said yes, but anyway, we now are the proud owners of a lot that's 20 feet by 180 feet deep. So try and imagine putting a house infill lot, by the way, with a shared driveway. So anyway, you say yes to it because no one else would. Right. We haven't developed it yet. I'll let you know when that happens. But the point is that we're the only ones that were willing to say yes to it, and that's the way for us to get our foot into that door into a core neighborhood in our Fargo area. The other thing with that is that you not only saying yes, but it's also more than just planning departments. It's inspections, it's forestry, it's everybody that you can think of. It's having those conversations with them. Especially for us, we do some rehabs, we do some demolition. So we're always talking with the forestry about, can we take this tree down? If you're from Minnesota, apparently June to July, there's a long-eared bat migration, so you can't touch any trees. It's illegal to, or to tear them down, just in case you didn't know that. I found that out. Anyway, point is that the more you can start working with others outside of just your planning department, it helps you to be known within that community. And then just as everybody else is saying, be the solution. We've had a lot of luck just saying, look, this is, you all are interested in affordable housing. Here's how we fit in, and how can we take that off of your plate and do that for you? What does that look like? What part of the community are you most nervous about, or want to put your resources towards? How can we be part of that solution? And just keep having those conversations. We have a fantastic relationship with our 2 major city governments, because we just keep asking how we can be part of the solution. And then you have to deliver. I mean, you just can't ask them and walk away, right? But you have to deliver on that as well.
We did an interesting thing, at least in our experience this spring, with our strategic planning process, and that we've often done stakeholder interviews, but this time we actually created a group of folks, and it was our consultant's idea to be completely transparent. But we had invited a lot of the government public servants, not bureaucrats. Good reframe. That's a bureaucrat, like public servant. But it invited those folks to participate in the broad group meetings that generated a lot of ideas that sort of guided the rest of the process, and interestingly found them chiming in much more sort of like positive ways than one might have expected, given how we often knock heads with them. And then a couple of those folks ended up being on the stakeholder group that, along with board members and staff members, sort of crafted or redone mission, vision, values, and work goal areas. And I have to say, like, pleasantly surprised by how excited the 2 government folks were about what we were creating in terms of a plan, and their buy-in to the values and the mission. It was great. So we haven't seen, tons of money falling from trees yet subsequent to then, but I think it built the relationship in a way that's going to bear fruit. And I previous to that, I would have just said those folks don't get to be that close to those conversations. Those are our mission and values, and it was really helpful for me to think about it more broadly than that.
Very proactive recommendation.
What level of government were they?
City housing leads, you know, so City of Duluth and Cook County. So not, it wasn't like the city administrator, but, you know, they have some clout. So.
And they're gonna sit around for a while.
Well, one would hope, yeah.
Just kind of have a question for the group. We recently purchased some land in a district where the alder is adamantly against affordable housing. Like, how do you find a champion to like try to persuade that alder? Or I don't know if I'm asking that correctly. I don't know, just like we have some alders that they're just like, nope, we don't want it in our districts. But now we've managed to purchase some land in those districts. Like, how do people navigate that? If that's, you can come back to me too, stew on it. And
My first question would be, how do they, the elders, define affordable housing? What does that look like? Because usually it comes down to a type of person or a group of people they don't want living in their neighborhood, right? And
right.
we ran into a little bit of that. For us, you have to be able to qualify for a mortgage. And so once we state, oh, you have to qualify for a mortgage, that seems to make that okay with a lot of people. And so but that's, we ran into that a couple times. And then once you have at least for us, once we've had our homeowners move in, they've made friends with thankfully, they've made friends with everybody but the one person that had a problem. And it turns out it's not everybody, it's usually one or two people that are band together, and everybody else is like, those are the crazy people on the block, so don't talk to them. It's usually what happens, at least in our case. So.
And that goes back to having those good relationships with all the communities that you serve, because then you can call on them to help you in situations like that, to advocate, to say, here was the effect that it had in our community. And again, sometimes it is getting a homeowner to speak so that there's a face and a story behind that.
If you have a homeowner in that area, there's nothing more powerful than that, because it just sucks all of the bad energy out of the room when there's a homeowner who says, hi, I'm John and I work at the school as a teacher's aide, and I go to First Lutheran Church, and my kids go to this school. And the other one is two questions. Could you afford to buy the house that you bought first now if you were starting over in your career? And if they're old enough to have adult kids, can your kids buy a house in the same neighborhood that you first bought a house in now? Just it sort of gets people out of the, what is my saintly colleague Jim, IGMFU, do you know what that stands for?
I got mine.
So anyway, if you get people out of that mindset, it helps tremendously.
Awesome.
So I'll put this out to the group as well. Pros or cons of public servants, learning here, on CLT boards or committees. Any pros and cons, thoughts on that?
I'll start with one. Those public servants, they know that community better than anyone else. So they're the expert on that community and what they need.
We have a lot of homeowners on our board, and having a public servant on the board who knows more than they do would silence them on some level. They wouldn't feel comfortable talking against what that person had to say, because obviously they know more than we do.
So what sometimes can be a pro can also be a con.
I think they're entirely valid, all of it.
What about pros or cons of electeds? Oh, you're going to jump in, sorry.
I was going to say, bureaucrats, a lot of the cities and towns in Colorado right now are struggling to fill positions in the city because they don't have housing for those people. So a lot of times those are people who have been firsthand experiencing the struggle of housing availability. So they bring a nice dual perspective.
Very pro. Pros and cons of electeds.
I have my own cautionary tale. When I first started with the land trust, I inherited kind of the incorporating board, and on it, I hadn't been really involved in Minneapolis politics. I worked for an organization over in St. Paul, and I was like, sweet, I got a council member on my founding board committee, and I was like, this is going to get me some sweet mileage. And as I started to peel back the layers, as I started to introduce myself to other people in the community, it became very evident to me that this particular city council member was not liked by many of the other city council members. He was a bit of a dud in the eyes of the public servants, and realized quickly that he was more than anything, I think, hindering our ability to get that early city support that I think we were talking about earlier that was so critical to us. When people say, what would I have done differently? If I could look back, the number one thing, if I could wave a wand and change it all over again, was at the startup time of our organization to have a higher level public servant on our founding board and early days of the board, before we actually really got very transactional. Because it's those insiders, as we've been talking about, at the city level that would have opened doors and would have kind of calmed the rest of the city staff that I think right out of the gate did not want to see another CDC. They didn't want to see another player in town. And who are we to think that we could somehow change the way that we were doing affordable housing in Minneapolis? And so I just put that out there. I think best practice these days, for me, it's a lot better to have an elected as an ally than to have them serving in any kind of capacity because of the potential conflict of interest.
And that's a perfect segue for the pros and cons of an elected on your CLT board. As I said, the mayor of Minnetonka serves as our treasurer. He's a great advocate for land trusts in general. He is the one that's spearheading this conversation with other mayors on how do we stop developers from buying single-family homes. That said, as much as he can advocate, when things come up within the community, and there's a project that Habitat is working on in the community to develop, well, we haven't landed on the number yet. That's where the process is at right now, but they're working, they'd like to do 15 townhomes and put those into the land trust. My board member as mayor would be a great advocate, but he can't vote on this plan. He has to recuse himself because of that conflict of interest. So again, the pros and the cons, you just have to weigh through it and do the best you can.
Thoughts, examples? Yeah.
One more way to work around that, on the same issue. Have an advisory board that culturally has equal footing in the conversation, just doesn't have the vote, but can have that sway internally without having to recuse themselves officially. Perceived conflict of interest is the gray area.
I've got one. That kind of flips the initial pro of having a bureaucrat on your board. In my experience, both working for a membership-led, community-based organization and having worked at the city of Minneapolis, where almost all of my colleagues lived outside of the city, I would say, at least in my personal experience, bureaucrats, they understand the community a lot less than the folks that are living it. So if your board is primarily leaseholders and community members, then it can be a pro, because then that bureaucrat can get that information from people at the ground level that are actually experiencing the issue. So they can learn from them and then take that back to the city and hopefully kind of champion the solutions that are being proposed.
Any other perspectives, experiences, cautions? Just, I would reiterate, there's a pro and a con with the bureaucrat, or we had a really good person early on our board who was kind of the deputy director for economic development for the city of Denver, and it was great having her there. She really did bring, I think, kind of big picture perspective, and we're early in our existence, and so, and she was definitely known in a lot of different communities. Having said that, once she stepped down, I think there was an acknowledgement that we had gotten to a place where we needed to have not just who do you have that's kind of like the Met Council you have, right? Like, is there someone more kind of on a regional basis that could fill that? We really don't have that. We do have a metropolitan planning entity, but
there, I would say, there isn't somewhat real leadership in the way I think you guys have leadership with your Met Council. So, so there's a pro and con to it, and then, yeah, on the elected side, I would say that's at least in our world, you do not want that on your board. Maybe as Reed, you were saying, an advisory committee where they have a role, but they're not directing you or your organization to kind of take that property on or take that deal on or not take it on.
Just one other quick thing. If you do have we have a very respected city commissioner on our board. He's fantastic. But if you do have somebody that's elected, make sure you explain to them that your organization doesn't have to run like the city government, because that's one thing we consistently fight. Like, you know, and since he is respected, as soon as he says, "Oh, we should do this," everybody's like, "Yeah, that seems great. We should do that." Like, well, you don't have to, you know, have 45 bids every time, kind of thing. So, just make sure you have that educational piece up front with your elected officials, because otherwise you'll end up with city-run meetings pretty quickly.
So deepening. How do we're there? Let's say presumably you're in a great place with the city. How do you deepen it and make sure that it's staying relevant? We've talked about a bunch of these things with the ARPA, making sure you have ready projects, something always to pitch, something to always pitch as a solution for the city, or, you know, in the case of a council or a ward, being able to pitch that. Quick to respond. I think it was like they're asking for it. Get it to them as quickly as you possibly can from a public servant perspective. Solid reporting and record keeping, and if you become known as that organization that doesn't have their stuff put together, I think it spreads. My sense is it spreads amongst city staff. Keeping steady political pressures, as well as steady press. We haven't talked about press, but if you can stay in the news, politicians, electeds pay attention to that. I think, you know, public servants do as well, but not. I mean, I think the electeds, especially here in Minneapolis, where there's 81 neighborhoods, especially during COVID, the way that those council members stayed connected with neighborhoods was through these neighborhood, you know, monthly neighborhood meetings. And so if you're getting out there in the virtual world and you have a presentation, that council member almost inevitably is also going to be on that call. And all you need are a few residents to say, yeah, we love the land trust. And that's the piece that the council member hears. And really, I think just helps build your organizational stock. And then just, you know, people like to be recognized. So I think just making sure that you are providing positive reinforcement, you know, especially where we are with the city of Minneapolis today. Any chance I get, I build up the city staff and just tell them how great they've been to work with and how we're in a real positive place, and that we really want to be seen as a conduit and a tool for the city to achieve their affordable home ownership goals. Are there other examples, things that you all use to build on that relationship with your cities? All right. I think you're up. Or is this me? You. All right. And I think I've, one way or another, chatted about all of these things already. Only thing maybe to call out is it's taken time. And the reason I put the years here is that some of this stuff started a long time ago. And so it's incremental. It's wearing down the public servants. It's being there when new electeds are getting elected in. It's having conversations when there's a race in a specific ward where you don't know who's going to win, talking with both sets of candidates. It's putting in the time so that you're ahead and you're able to have these conversations, and they know you're the go-to. They have your cell phone from an elected's perspective, and they can call you and get in touch with you. I think all these things help, and it's not instantaneous. Every once in a while, you get a wild win. This $3 million in ARPA money, never in my wildest world would that have worked out the way that it did. It was all a timing thing. But you know what? We had the relationship in the place where the staff felt comfortable making the recommendation to the mayor, who then put it in some big press release, and before we knew it, we were seeing a contract for $3 million in ARPA funds, which had you asked me a year ago, I never would have predicted that would have been the case. And on to you, Brenda.
Can I just ask you
Yeah.
one more question about that? So is it the city of Minneapolis' real estate staff that has the assessing authority?
No, it's
Is it like their real estate department?
no, it's the city has its own assessment.
Assessment.
Okay.
Jeff, can I say one thing about the last slide, relationships?
Yeah.
I think two things that we benefited from in Minneapolis are the longevity of developer staff and to a certain extent city staff. You're a great example. I've been around, my former boss was around for a long time. So we have credibility and we have delivered. And so if you're an ED or a board person, you pay your people appropriately. And then the other thing that I think got us some traction, we didn't achieve everything we hoped for, but both of our organizations were part of a thing called Make Homes Happen Minneapolis, which was a very concerted advocacy effort to dramatically increase the amount of money the city of Minneapolis put into affordable housing. And Jeff was one of the key voices in terms of that being for ownership housing. But that takes organizational investment to let people take the time to be a part of those advocacy efforts. It takes a lot of time and work. But I think, we didn't get to the 50 million dedicated affordable housing trust fund that we wanted. But at one point we got 40 million in 1 year. And that took a lot of time.
Ownership.
No. And it was by our organizations having the capacity and allocating that capacity to take the time to do that.
Very close. It doesn't happen magically, typically. Yeah.
Quick question on bringing up assessments and assessors. Does anybody have direction that they give the assessor on how to treat CLT properties?
We do. I'll have to ask our staff person. I can find out exactly what that is. But we explained the situation to him and he addressed it.
I don't have a good answer for you. What I can tell you is that City of Edina staff have reached out to the City of Minneapolis assessing staff to figure out how they did it and see if they can pull it off in their jurisdiction or geography.
Anything written that could be shared like that? Because I'm having to direct one assessor's office to another. I have no idea what they talk about.
The key document that we have that I'm not an attorney, but when I read through it, it feels pretty weak, is the letter that the State Department of Revenue wrote back to the city of Minneapolis in response to the request to be able to assess at different levels. And it was like, yep, you should be able to do this. And my fear is that people start peeling back the layers of this and they'll realize that maybe the city didn't really have the authority to do that. And I don't even know who the person at the Department of Revenue was that signed this letter, but it's one of those fears that at some point somebody will go back and say, this person never had the right to write this letter in the first place. What we have going for us now is that there's 350 homeowners that are going to lose their crap if tomorrow their property taxes go back to fair market value. And so making sure that we have a response from a homeowner engagement perspective to make some noise at the state level to help stick up for the city assessor's office. We'll see how it works. That comes to fruition. And I think this might be our last slide.
So this is just really for my organization, what the cities I work with do. Pretty much very similar to what Jeff has already said, the direct funding for property acquisitions and for general operations. They have the inclusion, some of them have the inclusionary housing policy or payment in lieu. Some of the cities are coming up with a preference for permanently affordable. So if an RFP comes out and I'm competing against another nonprofit developer who isn't going to preserve that affordability, the preference would be to work with someone like my organization or Habitat. So that's helpful. They've also, a lot of the cities I work in, because it's been 20 years, they have now started dedicated rehab funds specifically for our CLT homeowners. That keeps our homeowners engaged in the community. It's much appreciated by my organization. So that these homes, when they go to sell them, are still in as good a shape as when they came into the program. The property tax assessment is being considered right now in Edina. They're working on it, trying to mirror what Minneapolis is doing. And it's in the weeds. We don't really know. I think they're at the same point as what Jeff said. They don't really know for sure how they're supposed to go about this, but they're trying. Tax forfeited, blighted, and slums properties, the cities often call us for those. Most we will take on. There have been some we have had to walk away from. And then just simply direct marketing and referrals. We've been very good. The communities I work in will put out something a few times a year about the land trust in their water bills or in their quarterly newsletters. It's not only brought folks to our program to buy our homes, but we've had homes sold directly to us at a reduced price, and we've had homes actually donated to our organization through the homeowner putting it into a trust upon their death. It'll come to us. So those are some of the things that we've done that have been successful.